In this video, I will show you how to implement the user registration, authentication, and authorization using Blazor Web Assembly, ASP.NET Core Web API, Identity API, and SQL Server. So I will show you how to register users, how to authenticate users, and how to implement the user authorization. Then in the next video, I will show you how to create user roles and how to implement the role-based authorization. You can find the video link in the description. First, let's create a new project. So we can select ASP.NET Core Web API, then Next. So we can call the project Web API, for example. And let's call the solution My Store. Then Next. Let's select the version 9 of the .NET framework. We will use HTTPS. We will use controllers, so we need to check this box. Then let's click on Create. So now the project is created successfully. Let's go to program.cs. So here we can see that we will use OpenAPI and we will not use Swagger. And to be able to test this application, we need to install Swagger. So let's go to the application. We can make a right click, then Manage NuGet Packages. Then browse, and we need only to install Swagger UI. So let's write it here. Let's select this dependency and let's install it. Let's close this page. And to use Swagger, just after this statement, we need to add another statement. So we need to call use Swagger UI and we need to configure it to use the API documentation that is available at this URL, which is defined by this statement. So this statement allows us to generate the documentation and to make it available at this URL. Then let's configure the application to run Swagger. So let's go to the Properties folder, then Launch Settings. And here we are using this profile, the HTTPS profile, which is available just here. So here we can see that we will not run the browser. Let's change this and let's set it to true. Then let's define the launch URL. And it will be the Swagger URL. Also, we can change the port number. So let's use the port number 4000, for example. Now let's test the application. And we obtain this page. So we can see that for the moment we have only this endpoint. Now let's delete the default controller, which is available in the controllers folder. So let's delete this file. Let's delete the model as well. And also we can delete this file. Then let's create a new connection with the database. So we can use Server Explorer, or also we can click on View, then Server Explorer. Then let's create a new connection. Then let's provide the server name. So it is dot, which means localhost, / SQL Express. Then we need to trust the server certificate. And let's create a new database. We can call it DB10, for example. Then OK. So here we can see that the database does not exist and I want to create it. So let's click on Yes. Then we need to copy the connection string. So we can make a right click, then Properties. Then here we have the connection string. Let's copy it. And let's save it in appsettings.json. So here let's create a new section. We can call it connection strings. Then let's create a new key. We can call it default connection, for example. Then let's paste the connection string. So here we can see that we have /, but in trust server certificate we have some spaces. We need to delete them, otherwise we will have an error. Then we need to install new packages to allow us to connect to the database. So let's make a right click, then Manage NuGet Packages, then Browse. And the first package is Entity Framework SQL Server. Let's select this package. Let's select the version, then install. So now the package is installed correctly. Let's install another package. It is called Entity Framework Tools. Let's select this package. So this package allows us to use these commands on the Package Manager console. So let's select the version, then install. Then apply. Then we need to install Identity Entity Framework. So here let's write Identity Entity Framework. Let's select this package. It is identity.entityframework core. And let's install it. Now we have all the required packages. So let's close this page. And let's create the application DbContext class. So let's create a new folder. And let's call it services. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it application DbContext. So this class should extend the identity DbContext class of identity. So here let's add colon, then identity DbContext. Then we need to create the constructor. So we can use this helper and let's select this option. So we will create the constructor that requires a parameter that allows us to configure the application DbContext. Then let's add this class to the service container. So let's go back to program.cs and let's add this class to the service container. So just here we can call builder.services.addDbContext. And the type of the DbContext that we will use is application DbContext. Then we need to configure the DbContext to connect to the SQL Server database. So here let's add a parameter, we can call it options. Then let's call options.useSQL Server. Then we need to provide it with the name of the connection string. So here let's add a string, let's write name is equal to, and the name of the connection string that we defined in appsettings.json, which is default connection. Now let's save all the files. And let's create a new migration file that allows us to create the identity tables in the database. So let's go to Package Manager console. If you don't have it just here, then we can click on Tools, then NuGet Package Manager, then Package Manager console. Then here we need to call Add Migration. And you can create the migration called First Migration. And we obtain this file, First Migration, that allows us to create the identity tables in the database. Now let's create the tables. So we need to call update database. Now the tables are created successfully, so we can find them in the database. Let's expand this connection, then tables. And here we have the identity tables. So if you don't have these tables, then we need just to refresh the connection. So here we can click on a refresh. Then let's add the identity API. So we can use the documentation website of the .NET framework and we can use this page. So first we need to add the identity services to the service container. So we can copy this statement and let's add it to program.cs. We can add it after the addDbContext statement, for example. So this statement is useless because we are already using use authorization, but we can add it anyway. Then we need to activate identity API. So we need to copy this statement. And let's paste it here. So this statement allows us to add identity services to the service container. Then we need to enable the endpoints. So let's go back to the documentation website and let's copy this statement. And we will use it to configure the pipeline. So let's paste it here. Now let's run the application. So we obtain this page that contains the different endpoints of identity. We have the register endpoint, the login endpoint. We have also this endpoint that allows us to have more details about the authenticated user. So first, let's create a new account. Let's click on Try It Out, and we need to send the email address and the password. Let's send the request. But here we have an error with the validation errors. So we need to update the password according to these two constraints. Let's send the request. So this time we have a success response and the account has been created successfully. Now let's use the created account to log in. So let's use the login endpoint. Let's click on Try It Out. So to use tokens, we don't need to change these two parameters. So let's provide the email address and the password. And we don't need to use these parameters, so let's delete them. Let's send the request. So we obtain a success response and we have these parameters. So this is the access token and this is the refresh token. Now let's see the user details. So we can use this endpoint. But to test this endpoint, we need to send the token. So here, if we click on Try It Out, then execute, we obtain this error, which means unauthorized. So to be able to access to this endpoint, we need the token. So let's go back to the previous endpoint and let's copy the access token. And to include the token in the request, we can use Postman. So let's go to Postman. Let's create a new tab. I will send a GET request and here let's provide the URL. Then let's add the token. So let's click on Authorization. Then here let's select Bearer Token and here let's paste the token. Let's send the request. And here we have a success response with the email address of the authenticated user. Now let's create two additional endpoints in our application, one public endpoint and one private endpoint. So let's stop the application and let's create a new controller. Let's select API, then API controller, then add. Let's call it account controller. Then let's create a new endpoint that will be accessible to any user. So it will be accessible using the get method. We can call the method welcome and it will be accessible at the URL /API/ the name of the controller, which is account. So if the user is not authenticated, we can display the message you are not authenticated. Otherwise, we can display the message you are authenticated. Then let's test the application. So I will test it using Postman. So we can disable the browser. So let's go to Launch Settings. And for Launch Browser, we can set it to false. Let's test the application. Let's go to Postman. So we will send a GET request to the new endpoint. Let's send the request. So here we have a success response, and because we did not include the token, we can see that we have this message, you are not authenticated. Now let's include the token. So we can copy it from the previous tab. Let's copy it from here. Then here let's go to Authorization, then Bearer Token, and let's paste the token. So it is already here, but to be sure, let's paste it again. And this time we have you are authenticated. Then let's create a new endpoint that requires the user authentication. So in Account Controller, let's create a new action that allows us to return the user profile. First, let's create a new module. So let's create a new folder. And let's call it Modules. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it User Profile. Then let's add the properties that we want to return to the user. So we need the ID, which is a string, because the ID in identity by default, it is of type string. Then we will return the username, the email address, and the phone number. Let's go back to the controller. And then we need to request a service from the service container. So let's create the constructor. And let's request the service. So it is user manager of identity user. Let's add the required package. And let's save this service into a field. So we can use this button, then create and assign field user manager. Then let's create a new action. We can call it profile, and it will be accessible using the get method at the URL /API/account/profile. So it should be protected. So here we have to add the authorize attribute. Then let's read the data of the current user. So we can use user manager.getUserAsync, and this is the user property of this class. Here we have an error. So to fix it, we have to add async task. So if the current user is null, we will return a bad request. Of course, this should not occur because this method is protected using the authorize attribute. So if we execute this method, this means that we have the current user. Then let's create the user profile object, and let's fill it using the data of the current user. So we will set the user ID, the name, the email address, and the phone number. Then let's return a success response with the user profile. Let's test the application. So let's send a request to the new endpoint. We will send a get request to this endpoint. So if we send a request without the token, we have unauthorized. So let's go to the authorization tab. And here let's select bearer, and we will use this token. Let's send the request. So this time we have a success response with the user profile. Now I will show you how to test the application using the front-end application. So I already prepared this file, so let's open it. And we obtain this login form. So let's see the source code of this file. So in this file, we have the login form. So here we have the email address and the password. Then we have this submit button. So when we click on the submit button, we will execute the method handle submit, which is this method. So in this method, first we will prevent the browser from submitting the form. Then we will read the email address and the password from the form, and then we will create the data object that contains the email address and the password. Then we will submit the data object to this URL. So we will submit the data using the post method, and then we will read the response. And if we have a success response, we will display this success message. So we will display to the user the received access token. And if we have a bad response, we can display bad email or password alert. And if we have any exception, we can display this alert cannot connect to the server. Now let's fill the form. So before sending the request, let's see the console. Now let's send the request, and we obtain this alert, cannot connect to the server. So here we can see that we have this error on the console, cross-origin request blocked. So to fix this error, we need to configure our application to enable CORS. So let's go to our application, let's stop it. Then let's go to program.cs. Then here we can call app.useCourse. So we can call app.useCourse. We will set the policy to allow any header, any method, and any origin. Let's test the application again. Let's go back to the form. So let's clear the console, and let's send the request. So this time we have a success response, and this is the access token. Now let's create the Blazor application. So let's create a new project. Then here we need to select the Blazor application. So let's select Blazor Web Assembly standalone application. We can call it Blazor App, for example. Then next, let's select .NET 9. We will use HTTPS and we need the sample pages. Let's click on Create. And here we have the Blazor application. So when we run the application, we need to run the Blazor application and the web API. So to run the two applications together, we can make a right click on the solution, then Properties. Then here let's select Multiple Startup Projects. So for the web API, let's select Start, and for the Blazor app, let's select Start as well. Then OK. Then let's click on Start. And we obtain this Blazor application. So if we check the console, we can see that we have two consoles. This is for the web API and it is running at this port number. And this is the Blazor application and it is using this port number. Then we need to add the authentication and authorization to this application. So we will follow the documentation of this page. We will not use the server-side Blazor, but we will use the client-side Blazor. So we need to follow this section. First, we need to install this package and we need to add it to the file imports.razor. So let's copy the name of this package. And we need to install it in the Blazor application. So we can make a right click, then manage NuGet packages, then browse, and let's paste it here. Let's select this package and let's install it. So now it is installed correctly, so let's close this page. And let's add it to the file imports.razor, which is this file. So just here let's add @using and let's paste the name of the package. Then we need to create a custom authentication state provider that will handle the user authentication. So it is a service, so let's create a new folder. And let's call it services. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it custom authentication state provider. So this class should extend the authentication state provider. Then we need to implement the method of this class. So we can put the cursor here, we can use this button, then implement abstract class. So this method should return the authentication state of the current user. So let's delete this statement. Then let's create a non-authenticated user. So we can create this variable of type claims principal of new claims identity that corresponds to a non-authenticated user. Then let's return an authentication state of this variable. So we can return a task from result and you can create a new authentication state of this user. Then we need to use the authorize route view instead of the route view in the app component. So let's copy this. Then let's go to the app.razor file. So let's delete route view and let's replace it with authorize route view. Then we need to add some services to the service container. So we need to add the authentication services and the authorization services. Let's copy this. And let's add it to program.cs. Then let's copy this statement. And let's add it here. Also, we need to add the custom authentication state provider to the service container. So we need to add a new service of type authentication state provider, which is a custom authentication state provider. Then we need to update the main layout and the nav menu based on the authentication state of the user. So we can use the authorize view component. If the user is authenticated, we can display this content, but if the user is not authenticated, then we can display this content. So let's copy this code. And let's use it in the main layout. So here in the navbar, we can see that we have the about link. Let's delete it. And let's paste the code. So if the user is authenticated, we will display the username and the logout button. So let's delete this button. And let's add this logout button. And if the user is not authenticated, then we can display two buttons, the register button and the login button. So let's delete this. And let's add the login button that will take us to the URL/login and the register button that will take us to the URL/register. Also, we can improve the appearance of this text a little bit. So just here we can add some bootstrap classes. So we will add some top and right margin. Now let's update the nav menu. So in this nav menu, we can see that we have these three items. So if the user is authenticated, we can display these three items. Otherwise, we will display a paragraph. So just here, we can add the authorize view component. If the user is authenticated, we will display these three items. So let's cut this code and let's put it in the authorized component. Otherwise, if the user is not authenticated, then we can display the text, "You are not authorized." Let's test the application. And we obtain this application. So because the user is not authenticated, we can see that we don't have any item in the nav menu, and in the nav bar we have these two buttons. Now let's change the authentication states of the user. So let's update the custom authentication state provider. And instead of returning this non-authenticated user, let's return an authenticated user. So let's put this as a command. Then let's create a list of claims that contains only one claim, which is the username. So the authenticated user will have the name John. Then we need to create the claims identity that contains this list of claims. And this is the authentication type. We can give it any value. So this is very important. If we remove it, the user will be considered as non-authenticated. Then this is the user. So it is a claims principal of this variable. And then we will return the authentication state of this user. Let's test the application again. So this time the user is authenticated. So here in the nav bar we can see that we have the username and the logout button, and in the nav menu we have the three items. Now let's create the login component that allows us to authenticate the users. First, we need to configure the HTTP client to connect to our web API. So let's go to program.cs and we need to configure this HTTP client. So for the moment, the base address is the address of the Blazor application, and we need to change this. So we can delete this. And we need to replace it with the URL of the web API. We can define it in the file app-settings.json. So let's go to the file app-settings.json. It should be available in 3w root folder of the Blazor application. But here we don't have it, so let's create it. Let's select new item. And here we can write app settings. Let's select app settings, then let's create it. Then let's create a new key. We can call it web API address. Then let's copy the URL of the Web API from the Web API project, which is this project. So let's go to the Properties folder, then Launch Settings, and let's copy this URL. Let's paste it here. Then let's use this key. So let's go to program.cs, and here we can write builder.configuration, then the name of the key. Then let's create the login method in the custom authentication state provider. So first we need to request the HTTP client from the service container. So we need to create the constructor. Then let's save this service into a field. Then let's create the login method. So this method should return the authentication states, which is a boolean, and a list of errors if we have any authentication error. So first we need to create a new model. We can create it in this file, for example. We can call it form result. It contains the authentication states, which is a boolean, and the list of errors. Then let's create the login method. So we can create it just here. And because it is asynchronous, we will call it login async. So we can create this method that requires the email address and the password of the user, and it returns a form result. Here we need the try catch block. So in the try block we will connect to the web API. So we will use the HTTP client, and we don't need to provide the full URL of the web API because we already configured the HTTP client with this URL. We need only to provide the extension to the URL, which is login. So here we will send a POST request, and we will send the data as a JSON object. So the data will be the email address and the password. Then we need to check if we have a success response or not. So if we have a success response, then we need to process the response. Otherwise, we will return a form result with succeeded is equal to false, and the error will be bad email or password. So if we have a success response, then we need to read the response as a string, then we need to convert the response into a JSON object, then we will read the access token and the refresh token. Then we need to add the access token to the authorization header of the HTTP client. So we will add bearer and the access token. And of course, bearer should be with capital B. Then we need to update the authentication state of the user. So we need to call notify authentication state changed, and then we need to call this method that will return the new authentication state of the user. Now we need to update this method to read the user details from the web API. So we need to update this method. So let's put all of the code that we have here as a command. Then let's create a non-authenticated user. So we can copy this code and let's paste it here. And then by default we will return this non-authenticated user. So we can copy this and let's paste it here. We can delete this. So we will only return a new authentication state of this user. Here we have an error, so to fix it, just here we can add async. Then let's add a try catch block that allows us to send a request to the web API. So in the try block, we will send a get request to the web API at the URL /manage/info. So this allows us to read the details of the authenticated user. Then we need to check the response. If we have a success response, then we will read the response as a string, then we will convert the response into a JSON object, and then we will read the email address of the user from the response. Then we will create a list of claims that contains two claims, the username and the email address. So in our case, the username is the same as the email address. Then we will create the claims identity, then here we will create the claims principal, and we will return a new authentication state of this user. So if we have a success response, then we will return a new authentication state of the authenticated user. Otherwise, if we have an error or if we have an exception, then we will return the authentication state of this anonymous user, which is a non-authenticated user. Now let's create the login component. So let's create it in the pages folder. So first let's create a new folder. And let's call it auth, for example. Then let's create a new component. And let's call it login. Let's define the URL of this component. So the URL will be login as defined in the main layout. So here when we click on the login button, we will go to the URL/login. Then let's create some fields that we will associate to the page. So we need the email address, the password, and the error. Then let's create the page. So we can delete this. And let's create this div. So this div will be displayed in the center of the page. We can add a rounded border. We can add some paddings. And we can set the width of this div to 400 pixels. And also we can define the margin. Then here we will display the title of the page, which is login. And if we have any error, then we will display a bootstrap alert of type danger that contains the error message. Then let's create the login form. So we can add this div that contains a label with the text email, and we have this input field that is associated to the email field that we created just here. Then we have this div. In the label we have the text password, and the input field is associated to the password field that we defined just here. Then we have this row. So this row contains two columns. In the first column we have the login button, and in the second column we have the cancel button. When we click on cancel, we will go to the root URL. And when we click on login, we will execute the method login async. So we have this error because we don't have this method. So we can put the cursor here, then we can use this button. Then we can click on generate event handler, login async. So this method has been created just here. And we don't have the error anymore. We don't need this parameter, so let's delete it. Let's delete this statement as well. And this method should be asynchronous. So let's delete void and let's replace it with async task. So when we click on the login button, we need to execute this method that should execute the method login async that we created in custom authentication state provider. So we need to request a service from the service container, which is of type authentication state provider. So just here we can request the new service. We can also request the navigation manager like this. After the successful authentication, we can redirect the user. Then we need to convert this service, which is of type authentication state provider, into custom authentication state provider. So we can create this variable, which is of type custom authentication state provider. But here we have this error because we need to add the namespace. So we can put the cursor here, we can use this button, and we can add this statement. So this statement has been added here. We can add it either here or in the file imports. So let's cut it from here and let's add it to this file. And now we don't have the error anymore. Then we need to call the method login async of this authentication state provider. So we need to provide it with the email address which is available in this field and the password that is available in this field. Then we need to read the result. If we have a success response, then we will redirect the user to the root URL. Otherwise, we can display the error. Let's run the application. So for the moment we are not authenticated, let's click on login and we obtain this form. If we click on cancel, we are redirected to the root URL. Then let's provide the email address and the password. So here I will send a wrong password. Let's click on login and we obtain bad email or password. Then let's provide the correct password. So before clicking on login, let's take a look at the submitted data. So we can make a right click, then inspect, then network, then let's click on login. So now we have this button and we have these three items. And here we can see that we submitted a post request to the URL/login that contains the email address and the password. And in the response, we obtained the access token and the refresh token. And after receiving the access token, we added it to the authorization header of the HTTP client. So when we sent a GET request to the URL/manage/info, we included the access token to the request. So we can go to headers. So here we can see that we added the access token to the authorization header. But if we refresh the page, this time we are not authenticated. This is because this new application does not have the access token. So we need to store the access token in the local storage of the browser. To store the access token in the local storage, we need to install a new package. So let's go to the Blazor application, then manage NuGet packages, then browse, and here let's write local storage. Then we need to install this package. So let's select it, then install. So now the package is installed correctly. So let's close this page and let's add the local storage services to the service container. So let's go to the file program.cs. Then we need to call builder.services.add_blazor local storage. Then let's update custom authentication state provider. So here we need to request the local storage service from the service container. We can do this in the constructor. So we can request a service of type async local storage service. Let's add the package. Then let's save this service into a field. Then after the successful user authentication, we need to store the access token in the local storage. So let's update the method login async. So here we have the access token and the refresh token. We can save them in the local storage. So we will save the access token and the refresh token in the local storage. Then in the constructor, when we create this class, we need to read the access token from the local storage and we need to add it to the authorization header of the HTTP client. So let's go to the constructor and let's read the access token. So here we will read the access token from the local storage, and then if we have the access token, then we will add it to the authorization header of the HTTP client. Let's run the application. So now we are not authenticated. Let's click on login. Let's fill the form. And before submitting the form, let's take a look at the local storage. So we can make a right click, then inspect, then storage, then local storage. Let's select our domain. So for the moment, the local storage is empty. Then let's click on login. So now we are authenticated correctly and you can see that we have these two keys in the local storage. So we have the access token and the refresh token. Now let's refresh the application. So here when we refresh the application, the new application will read the access token from the local storage. That's why the user is always authenticated. Now I will show you how to log out the user. So let's go to the main layout. And when we click on the logout button, we need to log out the user. So just here let's add the onClick handler. And we need to execute this method. So we don't have this method for the moment, but we can create it. So let's click on generate event handler logout. So now we can see that we have the code section and we have this method. So we don't need the parameter, we can delete it. And let's delete this statement. Then let's create the logout method and the custom authentication state provider. So in this method, we will remove the access token and the refresh token from the local storage. Then we will set the authorization header of the HTTP client to null. Then we need to call this statement to update the authentication state of the user. Now we need to call this method when we click on the Logout button. So let's go back to main layout. And we need to request a service from the service container, which is of type authentication state provider. Then we need to convert it into a custom authentication state provider. So we can request two services, Authentication State Provider and Navigation Manager, that allows us to redirect the user after the successful logout. Then we can convert this provider into a custom Authentication State Provider. Then we can call the method Logout, and then we can redirect the user to the root URL. Let's test the application. So for the moment we are authenticated. Let's take a look at the local storage. And we have these two keys. Let's click on Logout. So now we are not authenticated anymore, and you can see that the data of the local storage has been deleted. Now I will show you how to register users. So first let's create a new model. So let's create a new folder called Models. Then let's create a new class. Let's call it Register DTU. Then let's add the different properties. So we need the email address and the password. Then let's create a new method in the custom authentication state provider that allows us to register users. So we can create the method registerAsync. It requires an object of type registerTTO and it returns an object of type formResult. In the try block, we will send a post request to our web API at the URL /register, and we will send the data of registerDTO. If we have a success response, then we can either return true, or also we can authenticate the new created user. In this case, I will authenticate the user, so we can call the method loginAsync, and we will provide it with the email address and the password of the new created account. And then we will return this object. But if we have registration errors, then we can display the errors to the user. So here we have registration errors, so we will read the response as a string. We can display the response on the console for debugging purpose. Then we need to convert the response into a JSON object. Then we will read the errors object from the response. Then we can create this empty list, and for every error that we have in the response, we will add the error to the list. Then we need to create an object of type formResult. Succeeded will be equal to false, and the errors will be the errors of this list. And then we will return this object. Now let's create the register component that will use this function. So let's create it in the auth folder. And let's call it register. Let's define the URL. Then let's create some fields that we will use in the view. So we need the email address, the password, the confirm password, and the list of errors. Then let's update the view, so we can delete this. And let's create this div, which is a bootstrap container that contains one row, that contains one column, that will be displayed in the center of the page. Also, we can add a rounded border and some paddings, and we can add some margin. Then we will display the title of the page, which is register. And if we have any error, then we will display a bootstrap alert of type danger, and for every error that we have in this array, we will display the error. Then let's create the form. So we can create this row that contains a label with the text email, and we have this input field that is associated to the email field that we created just here. Then we have another row for the password, and the input field is associated to the password field. Then we have this row for the confirm password. We have, of course, this input field that is associated to the confirm password field. Then we have this row. So in this row we have two columns. This is the first column that contains the register button, and this is the second column that contains the cancel button. When we click on cancel, we will go to the root URL. Then we have the register button. So when we click on a register, we need to execute this method. So here we have an error because we don't have this method yet. So now let's create this method. We can use this button, then generate method. So we obtain this method. Let's delete the parameter. We can delete this statement as well. So this method should be asynchronous. So let's delete void and let's replace it with async task. Then we need to request two services from the service container, the authentication state provider that we need to convert into custom authentication state provider to be able to execute the register async method, and the navigation manager. So this is the authentication state provider and this is the navigation manager. So if the password is different than the confirmed password, then we can add an error in the errors list, and you can display the error password and confirmed password do not match. And of course we need to exit this method. Otherwise we need to read the provider as a custom authentication state provider. Then we need to create an object of type register.DTU. So here we can see that we have an error, so we need either to add the using statement in this file, or also we can add it to the imports file. So let's go to the imports file and let's add a new statement. So we will add the models package. So here we can see that we don't have the error anymore. Then we need to call the method register async. So we need to provide it with this object of type register.DTU. Then we need to check if we have a success registration or not. So if we have a success response, then we need to redirect the user to the home page, which is the root URL. Otherwise, we will display the registration errors. Let's run the application. Let's click on a register. And we obtain this form. If we click on cancel, we are redirected to the root URL. Now let's fill the form. Let's click on a register and we obtain this error. Password and confirm password do not match. So let's provide the correct confirm password. Then a register. And this time we have the registration errors from the web API. So let's provide valid password and confirm password. Then a register. So now the user is registered correctly, and after the successful registration, we sent a login request. That's why the user is now authenticated successfully. Now I will show you how to protect components using the authorize attribute. So we will create the profile component. But first let's create a model to store the user details. So let's create it in the models folder. And let's call it user profile. We can copy the properties of this model from the web API project. So let's go to the web API. Then here we have the user profile. Let's copy the different properties. And let's add them here. Now let's create the profile component. So let's create it in the pages folder. And let's call it profile. Let's define the URL. Then let's protect it using the authorize attribute. So here we can add @attribute. And between brackets, let's write authorize. So here we can see that we have this error. To fix it, we need to add the namespace. So we can add it either here, or we can move it to the imports file. So let's cut this from here. And let's add it to the imports file. Then let's create two fields that we will use in the view. So we need this field of type user profile, so it can be null, and we need message, which is of type string. Then we need to request the HTTP client from the service container. And when the component is initialized, we need to send a request to the web API to read the user profile. So we need to override the method on initialized async. In the try block, we can set the value of message to loading. Then here we will read the user profile using the HTTP client. So we will send a GET request to the URL/API/account/profile of the web API. And we will read an object of type user profile. So if we have any exception in reading the user profile, then we will execute the catch block, and in this case, we will set the value of message to cannot read the user profile. Then let's create the view. So let's delete this. If user profile is null, then we will display the value of the variable message. Otherwise, we will display the user profile. So we can display the title of the page, which is profile. Then we will display the username, the email address, and the phone number. Then let's add a link to this component in the nav menu. So let's go to the nav menu. And we will display an item that will be displayed even if the user is not authenticated. So we will not display it inside this component. Let's copy this item. And let's display it outside of this component. Here we can write profile. The URL will be profile. And you can change the icon. So let's delete this icon. And let's use a bootstrap icon. So let's go to the documentation website of Bootstrap. Then icons. And here let's write profile. Let's use this icon. So let's copy this code. And let's paste it here. So this profile component requires the user authentication. Now let's create another profile component that does not require the user authentication. So let's save all the files. And let's copy the profile component. Then let's paste it in the pages folder. Then let's rename this file. And let's call it profile2. So let's update the code of this file. So here the URL will be profile2. We don't need the authorize attribute in this component. Then let's add a link to this component in the nav menu. So let's copy this item. And let's paste it here. So here let's write profile2 and the URL will be profile2. Let's test the application. So for the moment, the user is authenticated. And here we can see that we have these two items. Let's click on the first item. And here we have the user profile. Let's click on the second item. And we still have the user profile. Now let's click on Logout. So here we still have these two items. Let's click on the first item. And this time we have not authorized because in the profile component we are using the authorize attribute. Then let's click on the second item. So here we can access to profile2 component because we did not use the authorize attribute. But when we send a request to the web API to read the user profile, we can see that we cannot read the user profile. That's why we have this message. In the next video, I will show you how to implement the role-based authorization using Blazor Web Assembly and Identity. So I will show you how to create user roles, how to create custom users, how to register users with custom details, and how to enable the role-based authorization. You can find the video link in the description.